But Princep, please examine our lives. Everything is devoted to podcasting. To permit the recording of the show as a whole, there is almost no respect for the host. Someone who can no longer listen is put to death. The algorithms have only two outcomes. The non-listeners are put to death, and the listeners are released. We cannot even speak of Patreon. Princep, is there meaning to such a life?
There's certainly no money to such a life, because we need that Patreon cash.
Important reminder, please subscribe.
Please. We have bills, so many bills.
They're stacking up.
They're going to turn my electric off.
I can't remember the last time I bathed.
I can't believe they would turn your water off so quickly. That's super rude.
Well, it has been months.
Welcome to Science Fiction Book Club, a podcast for bookworms and stargazers. In every episode, we dive into the pages of our favorite science fiction novels to break down the big ideas, ask the nerdy questions, and maybe learn a bit about ourselves along the way. My name's Abu, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Opsa.
Hello.
We're done.
This is it.
First book completed on this show. How does it feel?
I almost want to say it ain't so, because I loved this one, but we've done it. This is exciting. Yeah.
Very exciting. My goodness. Okay, well, before we get into it and literally talk about the entirety of the book, let's take care of some housekeeping, starting as always with our spoiler warning. As the title indicates, we are covering chapters 27 to 35, which are the last batch of chapters in 3 Body Problem. So if you haven't read the entirety of the book, we highly recommend you go back and read along with our previous episodes, catch up, and then continue listening today.
And as always, we of course encourage you to read along with us, share your thoughts, email us at sci-fi bookclubpod@loreparty.com, and join that all-important bill-paying Patreon. Oh, that's at that same handle, patreon.com/sci-fi bookclubpod. You'll find our reading guides and discussion questions, as y'all, I'm sure, know by now, as well as those bonus clips and bloopers. And of course, you'll see our Discord there. Lots of conversations. Please join. We've got tons of readers, and you'll find yourself in good company.
That's right. Now, of course, all of those links will be in the show notes for you to check out later. With the housekeeping out of the way, here's the game plan for today's episode. No different than the previous ones have been. We'll start by summarizing the chapters from today's reading. Then we'll share some first impressions, not predictions, because we're finishing the book today, so we know how it ends. But we will then be diving into our sci-fi analysis. We have a lot to talk about today, a lot of science fiction going on in these chapters, and we're going to be diving deep into some of the big ideas. Of course, this is a book club after all, folks. That's our mantra. So stick around until the end of the episode because we will be sharing some comments and observations from listeners like you. So before we get into all of that, let's take a quick break. But don't go anywhere, dear listener. When we come back, we are finishing 3 Body Problem. We'll see you in a minute.
Your brain needs support, and new Ollie Brainy Chews are a delightful way to take care of your cognitive health. Made with scientifically backed ingredients like Thai ginger, L-theanine, and caffeine, Brainy Chews support healthy brain function and help you find your focus, stay chill, or get energized. Be kind to your mind and get these nootropic chews at ollie.com. That's OLLY.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
All right, welcome back, and without further ado,
Your favorite phrase. I love it.
My absolute favorite phrase. We'll be jumping into our summary.
I love it. Yep.
All right. So this one starts off with chapter 27, and in these first two chapters, actually 27 and 28, Wenji meets the American environmentalist and son of a billionaire oil magnate, Mike Evans.
Okay.
The two of them bond over their disillusionment with humanity, and reveals her message to the Trisolarans. 3 years later, Evans inherits his father's money and builds a second Red Coast base on a giant oil tanker, further validating Yeo's story. He then, of course, invites Yeo to join his nascent movement called the Earth Trisolaris Organization, the ETO. We've talked a lot about it, as their spiritual leader.
Yeah. And I would say spiritual leader is probably the key term there. This chapter made it very clear that Mike Evans is still the money man, and he's the one like taking care of the Excel sheets and paying all the bills and making sure things are running.
That's right.
Wensia really is just sort of like the matron spiritual leader figure of this group.
Right.
All right, chapters 29 and 30 are Liu Cixin basically dropping all pretense, and they're just like purely expositional chapters that fill in the history and details of this ETO movement.
Right.
We learn, for example, from these chapters that the organization attracted many educated and upper-class intellectuals like Wang Miao.
Mm-hmm.
And these scientists, soldiers, leaders, politicians, celebrities, all shared one thing in common. They were disillusioned with humanity. And what's interesting is the ETO's message wasn't able to penetrate further than that. Basically, anyone who was sort of in a lower strata, in the middle classes or lower classes, didn't quite buy into the ETO's message. They weren't quite as disillusioned.
Right.
We also learned that 3 major factions over time have emerged within the ETO, and they all kind of have vastly different ideas of how to handle the inevitable arrival of the Trisolarans. We have the Adventists and Redemptionists, which we've talked about at length in previous episodes. And the third group we learn about in this chapter is the Survivors.
Right.
Now, during her interrogation in these chapters, Wensia reveals that the Adventists have secret records of communications with the Trisolarans on second Red Coast base, on this oil tanker. And she doesn't know what's in these messages. The Adventists have been secretly communicating and keeping it from the rest of the ETO.
Right.
And thus, this sort of kicks off the next few chapters.
Yes. We kind of see here the growing split between and Mike Evans.
Yeah.
Because, as we know, Mike Evans is the one who's kind of hoarding the messages from the Trisolarans and keeping it from the rest of the ETO.
Yeah, never trust a billionaire.
Never trust a billionaire. That's the takeaway. None of those friendly neighborhood billionaires that are surrounding us all. In any case, this all kicks off the focus of chapter 31, where Wang Miao gets involved more deeply with the military operation to take down second Red Coast base and essentially capture those records before they're destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
We get this, honestly, quite brilliant plan from Dashi, who has just the most wonderful exchange with the generals during this meeting, where they basically kick him out, and he's like, "Okay, sure, but just before I go, let me tell you my plan." And it's, oh my god, brilliant,
incredible,
horrific, pretty insane. And
yeah.
as we know, it's essentially to use a net of Wang's super strong and incredibly thin nanomaterials to slice and dice the ship as it passes through the Panama Canal. Like, absolutely wild. And it's fantastic because Dashi basically foreshadowed this, predicted this way at the beginning of the book.
Yes.
In that kind of early first or second chapter, this being like the risk of these threads is that criminals could basically set them up and have a car pass through that, do
totally. Lots of foreshadowing.
Here. And to put it shortly, the operation is a success.
Hooray!
They witness Evans and many of the ETO members being killed.
Oh God.
Essentially instantaneously as
Jesus.
these threads slice through the ship.
Horrifying
And
stuff.
in any case, the secret communications are secured.
That's right. All right, chapter 32 kicks off another sort of series of chapters that are all interconnected, and we basically learn what is revealed in these secret communications that have been secured. We basically get the Trisolaran side of the first contact story.
Right.
And it very much parallels Yewencia's path to first contact as well. So we learned that a listener at post 1379 on Trisolaris detects Yewencia's message and not only realizes that Earth does exist, but also becomes enchanted with this concept of Earth, this concept of a paradise planet that always 24/7 is in a stable era. What the fuck, bro?
That's wild. Is that us?
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. Now, this listener, quite empathetic as well, because the more he thinks about it, the more despondent he becomes over what he realizes will be the inevitable destruction that the Trisolarans will bring to this paradise once they learn about it. So he takes action. He attempts to warn the Earth. Hence, we get the do not respond, do not respond, do not respond messages.
Mm-hmm.
And this, of course, is at the risk of his own life. He is taken in and interrogated by the Trisolaran leader, the Princeps, and they have basically this like emotionless debate about what the listener believes the value of Earth is versus what the value of Trisolaran survival is. This is perhaps finally achieving a dream that 200 plus civilizations of these people have failed at. And this listener just betrayed them by trying to warn Earth. Yeah. Kind of an ultimate and inverse betrayal of Yewencia. In the end, the Princeps condemns the listener as the greatest criminal in all the cycles of Trisolaran civilization.
Wow, what a claim to fame. That's incredible. I don't even know who that is for Earth. Like, we found him on Trisolaris.
We did. Wow.
And that takes us to the longest
oh my God,
somehow the wildest chapter in the entire book. Chapter 33, where we discover the iconic Sophons. Oh my God, just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
So essentially, over a span of many years, the Trisolarans decide to hinder Earth's scientific progress by developing this, I don't know, this dimension unfolding proton, essentially, which they deem the Sophon, and then they encase a supercomputer within it. I don't know.
My
it's
goodness.
Honestly some of the most mind-bending prose in this entire book.
Certainly.
And essentially they will fire 2 of these Sophons at Earth, keep 2 of them on the planet, and through a concept we all are intimately familiar with, quantum entanglement.
My favorite, yeah.
My favorite. They'll be able to essentially have real-time communication with planet Earth, despite being light years away.
Yeah.
And this basically came after an emergency meeting where the Princeps acknowledges humanity's potential to surpass Trisolaran technology by the time that their fleet arrives.
This was very cool.
I totally agree.
Like the way this story
really
plays with your perception of time.
Totally.
And makes you realize like 4 light years is so far away.
Right.
And actually at the rate that humanity historically has advanced.
Yes.
Like this, for some reason, this is the thing that just made me go, whoa.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Like essentially the Trisolarans were confessing to being vulnerable to Earth civilization.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that they were so advanced that they could fold matter in space and just explode new dimensions into being so that they could, effectively, conduct these miracles as far as we're concerned on Earth. And they're like, no, we're terrified of
Yes.
these humans, which was so fascinating to think about.
This was such a great concept, and I think the way that Liu Cixin thinks about time in
Absolutely.
the storytelling is what makes this story so unique, even in the
Yes.
sci-fi space.
Absolutely. And essentially, it also explains kind of a lot of the mysteries that we saw in the earlier chapters, like
Right.
how is it possible that the Trisolarans are projecting these numbers on Wang Miao's eyes, and how are they simultaneously causing the particle accelerators to report kind of bad data, essentially?
Yep.
So it really is kind of a really clever device here. And again, totally scientifically plausible. And we'll talk about this in our impressions and takeaways, of course. But this chapter wraps with the first message from the Trisolarans directly with everyone in the Battle Command Center. This isn't hearsay. This isn't them hearing a rumor about something from another person. This is them communicating directly. And what they say is,
You up?
you're bugs.
Oh, you're bugs. Just that Trisolaran booty call, at 3 a.m.
And you get the 3 dots, and then they disappear. And it's like, I don't know if they got it, Yeah. So, but honestly, kind of a equally tantalizing.
Equally tantalizing, yeah. You are bugs.
Yeah.
And that's it. And then they cut off communication.
And they cut off, and that's the last thing that Trisolarans communicate to humans in this book.
Right, for the next 400 odd years. Okay, let's wrap up this book. 2 more chapters to go. Chapter 34, which is simply titled Bugs. We join Wang and Ding, who are very drunk as they reflect on basically the doomed future of humanity as they currently see it.
Right.
And they discuss basically how pointless their own scientific endeavors are and how pointless the advancements of humanity would be in the face of such advanced Trisolaran technology. They're at a low point, clearly.
Definitely.
And this is when Dashi arrives, being his badass Dashi self.
Oh, yeah.
He gets them out of their funk. He drives them to this remote plain in the wilderness where he points out to the, what is it, cicadas, I think? Or
something like locusts, cicadas. Yeah,
locusts.
bugs,
I think locusts, some sort of bug like that. He points out and he draws this parallel between the technological gap of humans
right,
and said locusts. And whether the gap between humans and Trisolarans is that big. It certainly isn't. And Dashi makes the point that in spite of thousands of years of human efforts to eradicate things like locusts, they've never truly been defeated.
Right.
The bugs have not lost to humanity. If we are the bugs to Trisolarans, there's a chance that we may also not lose. And this has the intended effect. It instills this newfound optimism in Wang and Ding, and they recommit to their research and recommit to the idea of human resilience in the face of all odds.
Honestly, I would have been just as happy for the book to have ended at this chapter,
right there,
because it really was such a powerful moment, and such a cause for okay, we can do that. This optimism, this hope, this kind of
in a deeply pessimistic book.
In a totally pessimistic book, yeah, absolutely. It's kind of where the music starts to play, and you're like, okay,
yeah, right. Linkin Park starts playing, and you're like, all right,
yeah.
That was the end of the first Transformers movie joke. I don't know if that deep cut landed.
Nice. No, I was thinking of Where Is My Mind by the Pixies, which is at the end of Fight Club.
Both appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. But we, in fact, do have one final chapter, and it kind of stitches things up nicely. We get to see, Wenjia and her final remarks as well. And essentially, she climbs back to the top of Red Coast Space, and she's definitely, in a very reflective, somber mood as she reflects on the massive decision she made on behalf of us all, and essentially the broader fate of humanity. And as she's standing on the cliff, we hear the parting words of the book. She's watching the blood-red sun descend, and she says, "My sunset," and sunset for humanity.
Of
And scene.
course, the final words of this book have to be so pessimistic.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Classic Liu Cixin, you know?
Right,
He
right,
couldn't
right.
leave us on the optimistic Dashi quote.
I know for a fact 35 was the original chapter 34, and he was like, this is way too optimistic and positive.
Right, he flipped those last two chapters around
exactly,
on purpose.
Exactly.
That bastard.
Yeah.
My
Oh,
goodness.
man.
Okay,
Yes.
well, what did you think, Opsa, about this set of chapters? We'll zoom
Yeah.
out and we'll talk about our overall book impressions in a little bit, but just these set of chapters, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was the section that I just enjoyed the most. I found it to be, structurally, topically, and narratively the most kind of rewarding. Essentially. Like I thought
Yes.
it took some of the biggest swings, and there was just so many really mind warping kind of conversations and exchanges between, the characters, and just the psychodrama of the observer on a listening post and him reflecting on Trisolaran civilization, I thought to be so like fascinating.
Yes. Yes.
And it, I couldn't help but like find this to be, one of the, I mean, part of it I think is that it absolutely feels like this was kind of a microcosm of the larger book, but accelerated essentially.
Yeah.
Like
No,
like
that's-
you
yeah,
essentially
totally.
get so much of the same kind of parallel structure as the broader book as a whole. Like we have a flashback at the beginning of the section, and it's
Right.
to Evan's backstory, his origin story.
Yep.
And then you get this like exposition about this like strange organization, the ETO, and how it came to be. And then we have our like super freewheeling wild science and cultural commentary. And I think doing that in just this like set of 9 chapters, I couldn't help but like I couldn't put the book down. Like I found
Yeah.
myself up till 2 a.m. I think,
Yeah.
just like lying on my side, like eyes barely open, but just like I couldn't stop reading, and I
Certainly.
I definitely found this to be like one of the best parts of the book, definitely.
Right. Much like a Cybertruck, this is where the gas pedal got stuck.
Oh man.
You know?
Yeah.
Like these were the chapters where we hit accelerate on that and there was no breaking.
That's right. There is no stopping.
And I think I can finally admit to our listeners, I finished this book weeks ago. Like I've been faking in the last few episodes that I don't know what's happening.
Right.
Because I basically hit these chapters a few weeks ago. And I was like, no, I shouldn't keep reading. I should actually like predict stuff and not know it. And then I just kept, because I couldn't stop reading, much like you. And I was just, I remember texting you and I was like, oh, so fuck. I read the whole book because I couldn't stop. I'm gonna have to pretend not to know what's going on in the next couple episodes. So
real junkie vibes there. But I mean, that's what this book inspires, especially this block. Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, but tell me, I mean, more broadly, like what did this evoke for you? Like what were your overall takeaways?
Of course, I loved it. I felt the same. Basically, once I hit this set of chapters in my read through, I decided to just not stop, and I got all the way to the end.
Right.
But subsequent read-throughs, I think, led to more insight for me. Things I liked more and didn't pick up on the first time, but also some criticisms that I maybe glossed over the first time that the more I think about, the more I'm critical about.
Okay.
Let's
share.
So we'll share our final ratings on the book later at the end of the episode, but I do want to call out a couple of things now. The more I read this book, the more the entire fucking ETO keeps making little to no sense to me. It very much takes me out of the story every time we talk about the ETO. I have a very hard time believing that an organization of this size and this scale and this influence could actually form around just the idea of disillusionment with humanity. I just don't believe that there are this many people. Maybe I'm too optimistic. I just don't believe there are this many people out in the world ready for all of humanity to get eradicated.
Right.
So that part was very tough for me to sort of buy. That was a big pill to swallow.
Right.
I'm also not so sure that I agree with Liu Cixin's assertion that the uneducated masses are like too poor or too busy surviving day to day to become disillusioned with humanity.
Right.
I, in fact, think the opposite would be true. When humanity turns its back on you and you are ostracized or you are left to pick up the scraps by a system that doesn't support you, fuck yeah, you're going to be radicalized, you know?
Right.
So I almost got this sense throughout the book, and again, it really stood out to me on rereads, that there was a light bit of classism bleeding through here from Lu Xixin. There's a lot of people in this book that are extremely educated, extremely smart, and while Da Shi gets his time in the sun, he's your quote-unquote everyday man who's not educated, but he gets to play the hero. That's all well and good, but I get the sense that there's just like a subtle hint of classism all throughout.
Yeah.
Where like if you aren't the Wang Miao legendary scientist creating nanomaterials of the world, you don't matter in this story.
Yeah. You basically get no like screen time.
Exactly. Yeah. Did you get that sense, or am I just like projecting a bit here?
No, it's interesting. Like as you say that, I definitely find that criticism to be valid. It's something I think like I think I definitely overlooked, and but there just absolutely is this kind of through line of like classism and elitism in the book, and I think like I'm just reflecting here in real time. Like I don't necessarily think that spoiled my enjoyment of the book as I was kind of progressing, and I don't know if that maybe that's my own privilege, sneaking through a little bit. Like I for whatever reason did find myself to like be kind of nodding along, like this makes sense, but I think as I'm thinking about it a little bit more, it's actually quite out of touch of Cixin to describe like the elites of society as being the ones disillusioned and the lower, quote unquote, lower classes not having that sentiment,
right?
Because it just is kind of, it's just an inversion of anything that we have experienced day to day in our practical lives. Also, why would you be like a hustler, like racing to the top of society, being celebrity, all these things, and then
only
like
to tear it all down?
Like you also just don't care about humans at all. Like like I don't know. As I was reading, I think I was like nodding along, but I think your point your point stands. I will maybe defend him a little bit, which, no reason for me to, but
you're just a simp. You're just a simp.
That's right. Can't help but simp, I will say in the postscript, I took note of this thing that he said, which I thought was interesting. In the postscript, he writes, quote, "Reality brands each of us with its indelible mark. Each era puts invisible shackles on those who have lived through it, and I can only dance in my chains." And like, that for me, like it could be more of a commentary on, say, like the Cultural Revolution and his having lived through a time in China's development that was brutal in many ways, and also would have lent him with a certain outlook on the world, on culture, on influence his writing, certainly. But I think there's a little bit of like self-awareness in that, and so I think he may not have been self-aware enough to like keep it out of the writing and the kind of elitist portrayal of a lot of the characters, but there's some self-awareness there, I think.
That's an excellent point, that there is a cultural divide there. So to Lu Xixin, this might not be some classist thing and just more of a cultural commentary. And to be clear, I'm not trying to say that Lu Xixin kicks more people or something in his free time. Like, I'm not trying to brand him as anything he's not.
Right.
I'm just saying these are some of the like vibes I was picking up. Reading
definitely
throughout the book.
Yeah, definitely.
All of that said, I don't want to just criticize these chapters, because genuinely I loved these chapters.
Yeah.
I was enthralled completely by the Trisolaran stuff. Like once we hit that, oh my goodness, it was incredible. I'm completely blown away by the concept of the Sophons, right? It feels to me like one of the most unique concepts that I've read in sci-fi ever.
Oh, without a doubt. 100%. Like, you certainly, nobody here, I'm certain, has encountered this notion of quantum entangled supercomputers encased in a proton. Like, come on.
My goodness. Like,
pretty sick.
A truly unique concept, which, I think like, as amazing as sci-fi can be, there are many tropes that a lot of stories will just fall back on or just borrow from other classic sci-fi,
of course,
right?
Yeah.
And to come across something that is so dramatically unique, and you're just like, I've never thought or heard of this ever before. How did Lu Xixin come up with this?
Yeah.
Was amazing.
Absolutely.
Masterful stuff. I think, again, because of his like deep knowledge of science, he weaved in the science into the Sophon just enough that I was like, is this real?
Yeah.
is what I'm reading actually happening? Can we fold space? And then, of
Right.
course, I did a bit of quick research for today's episode and for today's conversation. Turns out like none of that is actually proven.
Right.
The dimensional folding stuff in the book is basically impossible, at least based on our current bug understanding of the universe. Maybe once we learn more and have more breakthroughs, it can be.
Right.
But again, props to Cixin for basically nerding out and borrowing a lot of these unproven conceptual ideas from things like string theory and quantum
Right.
mechanics,
Right.
and applying them to the concept of a sophon, to a fictional concept that feels so cool and new and
Absolutely.
something that simply hasn't been done in the entire history of sci-fi. So I can't say enough good things about the sophon. It was amazing.
Yeah, totally agree.
All right, so now that we've sort of gushed about these chapters, we do want to get into some deeper science fiction analysis and some takeaways. But let's take a quick break. When we come back, dear listener, we're diving deep into this final set of chapters.
All right. Well, welcome back, listeners. Without further ado.
Without further ado!
Yes. WFA. You know we love it.
Love it.
Let's jump into our takeaways. Abu, you want to kick us off?
Gladly. So for my takeaway, I want to dive deep into Trisolaran culture because, oh my God, I'm so curious. I've been so
Yes.
curious this whole book, but I want to pick apart all of these tiny little breadcrumbs that were sprinkled throughout the story and try and dig at the truth of Trisolaran society and their physiology, perhaps what they actually looked like. So one thing I want you, Opsa, and our listeners to keep in mind during this takeaway as I go through this is the extremely unscientific conclusion that our genius scientist Yewencia
Yes.
says in her interrogation. Quote, "A society with such advanced science must also have advanced moral standards," end
Right.
quote.
Right.
So let's keep that in mind. I'm going to circle back to that at the very end.
Yeah.
All right. So jumping into it, starting with what the Trisolarans may have looked like. In that first meetup chapter, if you will recall, back with Pan Han in that coffee shop, Pan Han explains that no one knows what the Trisolarans look like, and that their appearance actually changes every single cycle, which makes sense.
Mm.
You can imagine them sort of adapting to whatever the last thing that nearly wiped them out was. You know?
Right.
But he does reveal that the human computer that we experienced in the VR game did actually exist
Yeah.
on Trisolaris. So this leads to him explaining that the computer would theoretically work if the 30 million soldiers are, quote, capable of raising and lowering the black and white flags 100,000 times per second, and suppose also that the light cavalry soldiers on the main bus can run at several times the speed of sound or even faster, end
Oof.
quote.
Wow. That's wild. What does
the
that mean?
fuck? What could that mean?
I couldn't even visualize this. I was like, what?
Insane.
Yeah.
Is that what Trisolarans are capable of physically? We don't know. I mean, Pan Han seems to be theorizing here.
Yeah.
That the human computer would work if the Trisolarans could physically do these things.
Right.
Now, he goes on to explain that this cycle of civilization, the one that created the human computer, also had this like reflective surface on their body. These are like reflective surfaces that could be deformed. And they basically used this as ultra fast light speech. They like flashed lights at each other, reflections at each other.
Yeah.
And it was a way to communicate faster than verbally speaking.
Right.
So another clue perhaps as to what the Trisolarans look like or have looked like in their past.
Right. Basically, tinfoil with arms is what I've gotten so far.
That's exactly what I'm imagining too. I'm imagining
Yeah.
like a little beetle, but
Yeah.
all tinfoil.
Right.
And yeah, the little beetle arms can just like move really, really fast.
Right.
you know?
That's How many arms? We don't know.
Don't know.
Yeah.
All right. So in today's chapters, we get a bit more in the secret communications that are captured from the ship. We're told once again there is no description of the Trisolarans. Yewencia basically just imagines humanoids.
Right.
But we get some notable hints. The listener at post 1379 is quote unquote old by Trisolaran standards. And we learn that Trisolarans will typically live 700,000 to 800,000 Trisolaran hours, which is how they count time. And based on some conversion that the book later reveals, seemingly that means Trisolarans live 70 to 80 years, because 10,000 Trisolaran hours is roughly 1 human year. We also learned from the secret messages that the Trisolarans do have some sort of eyeball.
Right.
Because in one of the failed Sophon experiments that they conduct, they create this like microcosmos thing that comes together and looks at them with this giant eye in the sky. And this freaks everyone out on the ground. So they clearly were able to recognize an eyeball, and it freaked them out. So they have eyes.
They have eyes.
My image of them still hasn't changed. Still a beetle with tinfoil, and
Essentially.
because beetles have eyes too,
Yeah, exactly.
So that's what we know about their physical features. Moving on to what I think is way more interesting, their culture and society. A lot to say here because we get a lot from the secret messages in today's chapters. And of course, this is science fiction, so there's a lot of interesting comparisons to be made to human culture. In short, the Trisolarans have evolved into these brutally pragmatic species that are just hellbent on survival.
Right.
Which, of course, given their history, makes a ton of sense.
Right.
Now, the listener at post 1379 bemoans the fact that anyone who grows old in Trisolaran society and can no longer work a productive job is, quote, forcibly dehydrated, and the resulting dry fibers cast to the flames.
Oh my
Trisolaris did not keep the idle around. End quote.
Wow. That's how they refer to their elderly. The idle.
The idle.
God.
Kindling.
Yeah, kindling. Jeez.
Brutal. There's no 401k match on Trisolaris.
My God.
Brutal stuff. But again, an example of how pragmatic this species has become. Survival is the only thing that matters. We get some really great insight into their culture a little bit later in that scene where the princeps is interrogating the listener at post 1379. And frankly, the listener's description of Trisolaran society paints a really grim picture, but also a suspiciously familiar picture. Quote, Trisolaran society exists under a state of extreme authoritarianism. For me, the most intolerable aspects are the spiritual monotony and desiccation. Anything that can lead to spiritual weakness is declared evil. End quote. Perhaps that reminds some of y'all out there of a certain cultural revolution from the start of this book.
Oh, wow. That's a great parallel to draw. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think an intentional parallel that Liu Cixin would not have bothered drawing if it didn't matter.
Yeah.
Now, the Princeps has a counter-argument. He argues that the softer, weaker, more democratic societies that the listener pines for have existed in Trisolaran past, but they were the ones that were wiped out the quickest.
Right.
Because, again, buddy, we live in a 3-body problem.
Yeah.
Okay? But the listener, he's a softy at heart.
Yeah.
He's not convinced that survival at any cost is even worth it. Quote, we have no literature, no art, no pursuit of beauty and enjoyment. We cannot even speak of love. Princeps, is there meaning to such a life? End quote. I was taken aback by this quote.
Yes. And so was the Princeps, to be fair. He immediately condemned him to. He said that he was the worst criminal in every cycle. Immediately after hearing this, he was like, we have found you the worst criminal in all of Trisolaran history.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Now, I know I've been going long, but let me wrap up. Let's tie things back to the quote I shared at the top of the takeaway. All of this Trisolaran stuff, of course, as we've mentioned, raises some very fascinating questions and has some very one-to-one parallels with Ye Wenxia's experience with First Contact and then the listener's experience with First Contact, right? We get a lot of fun things like his hand hovering over the big
the slender finger.
The slender finger.
Yes.
But I want to wrap up by calling out some more subtle comparisons that didn't hit me until I reread these chapters between Ye and this Trisolaran listener. The most important of which, I think, is they both incorrectly assume that the civilization on the other end of their radio wave messages must be better because it has something that their people don't. For it's because the Trisolarans have advanced science, and so thus they must have advanced morals. For the listener, it's because humans live on a paradise planet, and thus must have an advanced culture, something that we don't have. We don't have art and love and beauty on this planet. That planet does, so they must be better than us.
Right.
And of course, I think the larger commentary here is that true and deep understanding and empathy with another civilization or race or culture or religion is never as simple as boiling it down to a stereotype or an assumption. That's the lesson that I'm taking away from this, that true understanding cannot be skin deep. And both Yewensia and the listener share this about each other's civilizations.
Right.
They send a couple of messages back and forth, make some large assumptions about each other, and then both, in their own way, betray their people in perhaps inexcusable ways.
Right.
So that's sort of my larger takeaway here is Trisolaran physiology, their society and culture, and what that says about Yewensia's actions and the parallels to draw between human cultures here on Earth. And the larger message about how different groups, races, religions, cultures can actually come to understand each other.
Boom. That's awesome. That is a fascinating take. And I really love this deep dive into Trisolaran society and culture that Cixin and of course you and Dissecting It offer, because this is why we read books like this one. I mean,
absolutely.
We're effectively we're talking about, on the surface at least, a fictional culture of a fictional species on a fictional planet. But despite that, we're compelled to draw parallels to Earth history and society. And we're forced to reflect on what this means about how we look out on the world and how we treat other species on Earth, for example.
That's
and
right.
It's, I love that. I really enjoyed that discussion.
Yeah. Sci-fi, baby.
All right. Let me drink some water.
I really got him with the sci-fi, baby.
That is actually the perfect segue into my takeaway, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And for mine, I kind of want to zoom out a bit and go pretty meta. So bear with me. But I think, what I've made pretty clear at this point, I hope, is that I'm a huge fan of this book. And a not small part of that is how this novel concludes. It is this last set of 9 chapters. It is this deep dive into Trisolaran culture and civilization and the way that we're being compelled to have these discussions about what it means, for our perspective on the world.
Right.
And of course, that's not altogether surprising. This book was obviously written by a living, breathing human, But notably, that man was born in Beijing in the 1960s. It's a world removed from the one that you and I inhabit today. As the Trisolarans were reflecting, we rapidly advance, decade to decade. It doesn't take hundreds of years. It's decade to decade.
Yes.
We've completely uprooted what we know. Our civilization has changed so dramatically. The fact that we are discussing this novel that was published 30 years ago and on practically the opposite side of the globe is a fascinating thing. The rapidity with which information travels today is a fascinating thing and totally speaks to the Trisolaran fear of how quickly we could probably defend and probably go on the offense against them, practically speaking.
Totally. That indomitable human spirit.
Exactly. And it also just says something about the cross-cultural, cross-time impact that great writing can have. There's something actually that Cixin says in the postscript that really resonated with me and speaks to this point. Quote, "Science fiction is a literature that belongs to all humankind. It portrays events of interest to all of humanity and thus should be the literary genre most accessible to readers of different nations. Now,
Wow.
of course,
My God, I
Cixin,
love that.
being a science fiction writer and us being science fiction readers are totally biased here.
Of
you
course.
know?
Yeah.
There's no question. But I do want to kind of further develop the case for this. I have basically 2 points that I want to articulate. I had a few more, and I realized I need to pare this down because I am absolutely a science fiction stan, as I think a lot of our listeners are as well. So
Yeah.
I won't go ad nauseum. I've got 2 points, and I'll articulate them hopefully quickly.
I'm ready.
So one, that science fiction often serves to define the edge of our present techno-scientific abilities. That, I think, is like indisputable. Like we get a lot of, even in this book, there are a lot of things like the Sophons that are just outside the realm of what we can do,
Yeah.
And that is like obviously super entertaining, but it also speaks to what's like really remarkable about science fiction, that it does inspire the imagination, that it does push us to, defy our limitations. And this isn't a totally new notion. 2 of Arthur C. Clarke's 3 laws captured this idea really succinctly decades ago. The first being, quote, "The only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible." Which
chills.
just love that, like you can't help but love that. And the second, which is probably familiar to all listeners of this podcast, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Yep, classic.
So, magic, in this case, being anything that seems to defy reality and its rules, is absolutely how our ancestors would have thought about us being able to globally. I mean, we've got listeners from surprisingly all over the planet,
Yes.
And it's something that I was like really taken aback by the first time I got to see some of those metrics. Really interesting.
Yeah.
But that would have absolutely been described as magic by our ancestors. And the fact that we're exploring the surface of a planet like Mars, 140 million miles away.
Wild.
I mean, come on. It's bizarre. I mean, it's actually just bizarre.
Yeah.
That seems like magic, And
Definitely.
we certainly we have written about these sorts of things long before we were actually able to perform the science and engineering to excavate those truths. And that is what's so remarkable about science fiction. By
Truly.
exploring and giving language to the magical, it inspires us to defy the status quo. It inspires us to invent technologies to bring the tomorrow of imagination just a little closer to today.
Yes.
So
move over, Arthur Clarke. Because Opes has got bars.
Somebody's cooking. All right. We're cooking. That's so funny. Okay. So the second and last point I promise I'll make about the remarkable thing that is science fiction is that, like most literature, it holds a mirror up to our cultural values and assumptions.
Yeah.
You talked about this in your takeaway with regard to the listener on post 1379 and Yawenji, and how, there's this kind of mutual and incorrect, frankly, assumption about the superiority of the cultural and moral values of the other on the other side.
Yeah.
And, this isn't unique to science fiction by any means, but it does seem to be inextricably woven into the fabric of the genre. As much as it can be this entertaining diversion from one's day-to-day life, I just really can't recall any science fiction work that can really prevent you as a reader from reflecting on yourself and the world around you.
Yeah.
And this novel, we obviously have seen it in our discussions, at the top of this episode about the classism of the ETO and possibly the author and possibly yours truly, not checking his privilege and recognizing how maybe my own privilege is like creeping into my like read of the story.
Yeah.
And in the brutal reality of the Cultural Revolution and the question of the morality of extraterrestrial beings and what
Right.
that says about our own, But it's kind of inescapable, in speculating plausibly about worlds like our own, just altered in a few specific ways. We're kind of forced to confront, our truths and our assumptions about, the social patterns and choices that we have made.
Yeah.
And when science fiction succeeds in doing those two things, I think it has the potential to achieve a grander outcome. The fostering of cross-cultural empathy and hopefully, a richer, more humanitarian worldview.
I mean, it is fact that studies have indicated that people who read more, watch more books, go to more museums, like consume more art and in general, tend to be more empathetic,
Absolutely.
to be more open-minded to ideas that challenge their own.
Yes.
To be, I think this is always a big thing where I grew up in a household where things like video games, movies, even music was considered a waste of time.
Right.
Was considered something that would rot my brain.
Right.
And really the only outlet I had growing up for a long, long time was books. Like libraries were my happy place, and my parents took me to libraries all the time, like every single day. And I consumed them voraciously, but I think that extends to all art and even books beyond sci-fi, like just being able to experience the world through the lens of a fictional character, through the lens of an author's perspective from China in the 1960s.
Totally.
Like Liu Cixin.
Yeah.
Helps foster this mentality of greater empathy and more openness to ideas that aren't your own, but also greater just understanding that there is a world outside your world.
Totally.
Outside of just your head, your community,
Yes.
your family, your neighborhood, your school.
Yeah.
Like that, I think, is the power of art. It's a way to communicate with each other as humans. And I think bringing it full circle back to your point here, I think sci-fi does that like with a scalpel, is able to penetrate. I'd argue, people are going to email us about this, I'd argue perhaps more than other genres, more strongly and more deeply than other genres. Sci-fi is perhaps able to get to that point and really jab at us with it.
Yeah.
So I love where you're taking this takeaway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it certainly is what compels us to read the works of this genre and to have obviously started this podcast and the wonderful community of readers and listeners that we've got who I think share this passion. And really it's a passion not solely for kind of science fiction on its own. It's like this larger effort of like kind of self-interrogation and like introspection. And again, it just seems to be part of the definition of like good science fiction, that it raises these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So well said.
I'll wrap up my take here actually with one of Liu Cixin's parting remarks in the postscript, which I found to just be so really quite beautiful. And he says, quote, "Science fiction often describes a day when humanity will form a harmonious whole, and I believe the arrival of such a day need not wait for the appearance of extraterrestrials."
Oh my God. I'm tearing up.
Mic drop. I mean, what more can we say? I mean, that's the hope. That's the aim. I mean,
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, as we like to do on the last episode, when we are done with the book, we do give it a rating. This can be as serious or as silly as you'd like, Opsa, but I am curious. Out of 5, how would you rate this book?
Yeah, I mean, I
think I know where this is going.
I think we know where this is going. I couldn't honestly rate this anything less than 5 planet encircling sophons out of 5.
There you go.
Yeah, this is without a doubt one of my favorite sci-fi novels of all time, and one that, valid criticisms aside, I can't help but unequivocally recommend. This is a stunner, an absolute stunner.
Definitely. Myself, I would give it 4 problematic bodies out of 5.
Okay.
And the reason it's not a 5 out of 5 for me is just because some of that dense science jargon that was found throughout the book that I've criticized on many episodes so far.
That's right.
And the weaker characters, which I think is a very common criticism of this book.
Totally.
And, we've discussed that at length now.
Yeah.
Those two reasons are what dropped this down just a peg for me from a perfect 5-star book to a 4-star book that I, too, unequivocally recommend to any sci-fi fans out there. Loved it. What a great book and what a great journey.
Absolutely.
Now, to wrap up, we also want to share some community thoughts from you, dear listener, here at the end of the episode before we say goodbye. So let's get into it.
Yeah. So in response to our question on Spotify about what makes you pessimistic or optimistic about humanity, Almer responded, "Well, pessimistic because of our selfishness and lack of a long-term vision."
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That's a fair response. I can't fault them for having that opinion. I don't necessarily disagree.
I wonder if it would have changed 9 chapters later. I mean,
that's right.
Maybe a little follow-up, maybe
Almer,
in
let us know.
Discord.
Follow up.
Yeah.
Let us
Get back
know.
in Discord. Let's hear.
Another response we wanted to share, this was also from Spotify. We asked all of you whether you thought Yewencia's betrayal of humanity could be justified. And Daniel responded, quote, "Perhaps, but I do see her choice as a terrible failure of imagination," end quote.
Yeah.
I loved that. I loved the way
Absolutely.
Daniel put that.
Yeah, totally. I think absolutely vindicated as we wrap up this book. I think
Yes.
she has a reckoning with herself as she realizes the Trisolarans aren't as sick as she thought they were. They're kind of terrible. Unless you want to get rid of all of our art, culture, leisure, joy, love. I don't think we should be aspiring to Trisolaran culture.
Yeah, I agree.
And finally, we asked in a Spotify poll if you'd push the button,
Ooh.
the big red button, and respond to an extraterrestrial message. 63% of us are rule followers and said no, which was interesting. All right.
Okay. I consider myself to be in that 63% category.
I recall. That's interesting. And Josh in Discord added that he would, in fact, push the button.
Hello.
Unless he received a message pleading with him not to respond with more and more exclamation points.
So many exclamation points.
Also, how did the listener know that was such an emphatic way to be like,
right?
Don't do this?
Right? Do we share grammar with the Trisolarans? That is
something to investigate. He also wrote, "I haven't lost my faith in humanity. There's just no way I could condemn billions of people to death or suffering from an outside force."
Yeah, I think, according to the poll, 63% of us agree with Josh on that. Wouldn't hit that button.
Yeah.
I want to hear from the 30-some% of you.
Yeah.
Who would hit that button and why?
They must be the elites. They must be those social elites.
The
billionaires amongst us.
Disillusioned with humanity.
That's right.
Wow. All right. Well, that's our episode. That is The Three-Body Problem. What an amazing book. What a fun journey we've been on together.
Can't believe we're at the end of it.
Oh my goodness. We will be starting a new book in our next episode. And this is exciting because our next book is a Hugo, Nebula, and Arthur C. Clarke Award winner.
What?
All 3 of those
That's incredible.
have been won by Ann Leckie, author of Ancillary Justice.
Exciting.
The only book, actually, to ever win all 3 of those prestigious awards. So we'll be diving into Ancillary Justice on our next episode. Make sure you do the reading before then. And of course, if you are curious what the schedule is for the season and what books we'll be covering and what chapters you have to have read for every episode, our full schedule is always linked in the notes below.
That's right. Well, friends, I told you all we have left to discuss is bullshit. We've been recording for a while now. Let's remember what the host said. Make sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
And be sure to check out the other shows on the Lore Party Podcast Network on loreparty.com. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at lore_party. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, humans do not need saving. They're already living much better lives than they deserve.